Okay, good evening, everyone. I think we'll start and people can still come in. It's really nice to see you all, to see faces from Zurich, but many faces from elsewhere as well. Familiar and new, this is really lovely to start this conference. So a warm welcome to Listening In, Conversations on Architectures, Cities and Landscapes, 1700 to 1900. I'm Anne Hulsch, and I'm co-chairing this conference with Sigrid de Jong, who's next to me. So thank you all for coming to hear Professor Mabel Wilson's keynote lecture tonight, which will open this conference. We will spend the next 2 days listening to talks and presentations, revealing new actors, new conversations, new methods, and many of you with the yellow name tags will present those to us. Professor Jane Rendell, who sits over there, will then close the conference with her keynote on Friday evening. For all those who are here as audience, please join us again then in the main building of ETH in the center. So this event was born out of conversations between Sigrid and I while we were both setting up a collaborative research project here at GTA, the Institute for History and Theory. My group is called WoWA. You see the logos somewhere of the two projects. WoWA is short for Women Writing Architecture, 1700 to 1900, and is funded by the ERC. And Sigrid's project is called Building Identity, Character and Architecture Debate and Design, 1750 to 1850, and is funded by the SNSF. Our main aim with this conference really is to open up our discipline, architectural histories, as well as related spatial and visual histories, to new actors and new sources that have so far been considered less or even not at all. And for this, the title Listening In was chosen very purposefully, to highlight a need to listen we felt in this moment right now in which we find ourselves of rising inequalities and polarizations. We mean this as a call to listen to each other here in this room, as well as to other, perhaps forgotten voices, shedding at least some of the less useful preconceptions and limitations of disciplinary canons and surveys that I'm sure many of us have felt over the last years.
And a very warm welcome from me as well. To continue on what Anna was saying, we are not alone in this quest, of course, and find hope, solidarity, and ways to work towards inclusive histories in many places. Now, just last week, Sadie Smith's new novel, I will show you the cover, The Fraud, was published, in which she tells the compelling story of a housekeeper in Victorian London, Mrs. Touchet, who is a feminist, an abolitionist, campaigning to end British slavery, and who becomes obsessed with a formerly enslaved Jamaican man, Andrew Bogle. She tries to convince him to tell the story of his life on a British-run Jamaican sugar plantation, and she succeeds, penning down the brutal conditions of slavery. Mrs. Touchet works for a reportedly terrible novelist, William Ainsworth, whose novels apparently outsold those of Charles Dickens, but who was entirely forgotten 30 years after his death. The stories of these three entangled lives, all characters that haven't been listened to, spoke to us when we were preparing this conference. And Smith makes them heard again, just as we aim to do with the protagonist and conversations we are presenting here at Listening In. In an interview on a radio show, Smith tells us about her motives. And I quote her, "People lived and died in pain and obscurity and under total oppression. The very least you can do is want to know it," she says. And she further states, "And that's not a black issue, that's not a white issue. I don't think in those terms. That is a human issue." Unquote. Now, interestingly, Smith is intertwining novel writing with elements based on real historical events. And as he stresses in the same radio interview, and I quote her again, "History is something we participate in together. We are all involved in history, and all have something to gain from understanding what happened, exactly what happened, unquote. Now, this is what we aim to do with our conference, Listening In. We try to understand, interrogating history together.
We recommend the novel to everyone. I still have to read it as well. It's literally come out last week, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we're now tremendously honored to welcome Professor Mabel Wilson as our opening keynote speaker. Her groundbreaking work is a great inspiration for both of our research projects, and many in the room, I'm sure, and is, most of all, especially poignant for opening this conference, we feel. Mabel Wilson is the Nancy and George E. Rupp Professor of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and a professor in African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University, as well as the director of the Graduate Program in Advanced Architecture Research, the co-director of GSAP's Global Africa Lab, and the project on spatial politics. She is a passionate architect, curator, and author, addressing urgent contemporary issues of race, slavery, public space, and the black counter-public sphere, both in a thorough historical analysis and in a reframing of our discipline. You can see her work currently on view at the Venice Architecture Biennale, where she curated an installation called Unknown, Unknown. This is a meditation on the archive of slavery that was developed in the context of the design she completed with her practice studio and for the memorial to enslaved laborers at the University of Virginia. She was also a co-curator of the exhibition Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America in 2021 for the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And her books, which some of them are exhibited in the kiosk in the GTA foyer right now, so go and have a look. Her books include Negro Building, Black Americans in the World of Fairs and Museums, 2012. Also, Begin with the Past, Building the National Museum of African American History and Culture, 2016, as well as the groundbreaking co-edited volume, Race and Modern Architecture, From the Enlightenment to Today, published in 2020. Today, Mabel proposes that together, we listen to the 18th century black female author, Phillis Wheatley. So let's turn the spotlight now on Wheatley's poetry and discourse and listen to Mabel's lecture, which is entitled A Bright Abode, Phillis Wheatley's Poetic Spaces of Liberation.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. I know classes are not in session, so I appreciate folks coming to the beginning of what I think will be an amazing series of talks and conversations and I would say thinking together. But I do want to thank Anne and Sigrid and the Women Writing Architecture group, Martin and Sol, also Alejandra Fries, who helped make my arrangements, and all of the others for the extension of this generous invitation to be able to join and contribute to what I think will be a lively and timely conference over the next 3 days. Now, the conference's charge, as was just shared, was listening in. And this reminded me of a dear friend and interlocutor, Tina Camp's breathtaking work called Listening to Images. And so when Tina says she listens to the quotidian pictures of contemporary black youth in the United States, she hears them, quote, refusing the impossibility of black futurity. Since, in the wake of slavery, even in the 21st century, they do not have a future in the United States. So my talk today, in some ways, will ask, what do we hear when we listen to the image of an enslaved poet, Phillis Wheatley, and to the conversations she initiated within the domestic and public spaces hostile to her very being when marked as enslaved, as black, and as woman? Now, how did Wheatley stake a claim for her own and others' liberation? And what possible spaces of black futurity did she imagine? Imagination. Who can sing thy force? Or who can describe the swiftness of thy course? soaring through the air to find the bright abode, the imperial palace of the thundering god. Phillis Wheatley wrote On Imagination sometime in 1772. It would be included in her collection, Poems of Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, published the following year, 1773, in London. A complex work from the perspective of many, many literary scholars, On Imagination explores theistic themes and classical forms in dialogue with the poets and the philosophers of her day. In a proto-romanticist ethos, Wheatley reflects on her mental capacity to break the chains of her own captivity. She conveys an intellect ready to embark on an imaginary cosmic journey of liberation to a bright abode, a lush pastoral plain, perhaps modeled on her faint recollection of her native Senegambia on the western coast of Africa. Now, in a portrait for the frontispiece of her book, believed to be made by her fellow Black Bostonian, Scipio Moorhead, we see Wheatley enthralled in such a moment of introspection and imagination. Wheatley is shown with her left hand cradling her head, her eyes locked in a steadfast gaze deep in the thralls of contemplation. Her right hand holds a quill pen as she commits verse to paper. A nearby book attests to her ability to read and reflect on the ideas of others. Being literate facilitated not only an understanding of memory and history, but also incited her to imagine what is possible in the future. Moorhead's rendering depicts a self-assured subject enmeshed in the realm of ideas, a confident interlocutor in the world of arts and letters. Now, other important details to note in Wheatley's portrait, as one of the few published women authors of British North America at the time, is her modest dress. A plain cotton shawl and cap indicates her class status as a servant. She sits with her back framed by the curves of a side chair, suggesting the Queen Anne style, popular with Boston craftsmen who exported their wares to other parts of the British colony. So this is a typical Queen Anne back, but you could see, right, the ways in which the Boston craftsmen really established a kind of base for that style. If she were sitting, Wheatley sits and writes on a wooden oval-shaped desk or table. Oh, and here you can see typical Queen Anne chairs made by craftsmen in Boston in that period. These were made out of walnut. It's interesting what you can find when you start to look at Boston furniture in the 18th century. It just goes on endless. You know, but when you start to read, it's very interesting to try to figure out who was crafting it, who was buying it, where it was going. Yeah, anyway, let's just say it was a wormhole. So Wheatley sits and writes at a wooden oval-shaped desk or table. Now, if she were sitting at a desk, it would have been an unusual design to find in a merchant's household in a North American colony in the mid-18th century. Like an oval desk would have been you would have paid a hefty price to get something that specific. Furthermore, desks, often produced with cubby holes for letters, ledgers, and bills, paired with a shelf unit, were typically the domain of male heads of household. You would rarely find a woman sitting at one of these desks. So with that in mind, perhaps Moorhead sketched the poet sitting at a Queen Anne-style tea table, perhaps made of mahogany, which she used as a desk. Certainly, as an enslaved servant in the household of Susanna and John Wheatley, a Boston tailor, merchant, and moneylender, Wheatley might have delivered tea service to the tea table for her owner, Susanna Wheatley, and guests, or perhaps polished its mahogany surface to a rich ebony hue as a sign of its family's prosperity and class status. Now, by entering into the world of arts and letters as a learned subject, someone brimming with observation and ideas, Phillis Wheatley conveyed a rich inner life, an intellectual breadth characteristic of an enlightened individual. The engraving perhaps projected into the future an image of her as a free person, free to think and free to move about. But yet, in reality, as an enslaved person, she was not free, but instead lived within and skillfully navigated a world of unfreedom that began within the Wheatley's house and expanded beyond its confines on a daily basis. Therefore, as a woman living in a colonial city, Boston, in transition during a revolutionary period, she also traveled to London in 1773. What types of spaces, domestic and public, did Wheatley occupy? What do they tell us about how racial difference and gender impact an emerging liberal democracy? And what kinds of public spaces were being constructed for and by the people of the United States, as imagined by key figures like the founding father, architect, and slaveholder Thomas Jefferson? And where was Wheatley's place in the new nation as per Jefferson's learned assessment? Though 10 years older than Phillis Wheatley, he was born in 1753. Wheatley was believed to be born 1763. Thomas Jefferson lived till a ripe old age of 83. Wheatley died at age 31. Whereas Jefferson left an astonishing record of some 19,000 letters, Wheatley's legacy amounts to a mere 22 extant letters. Jefferson spent much of his adult life in resplendent homes in Washington, D.C. and Paris, Washington, D.C. being the White House. And this included two well-appointed plantation homes he designed in Monticello and Poplar Forest. Now, modeled on a plantation villa, Monticello was very much at the center of a large plantation that spanned some 5,000 acres, farmed by a population of enslaved men, women, and children that numbered around 200 at any time. Jefferson, over the course of his life, owned over 600 slaves, including some who were familial relations. He, for example, owned his children with Sally Hemings. Now, by contrast, we know very little about Wheatley's pre-enslavement life in Senegambia, and little about the house where she lived as the property of the Wheatleys, or where she lived once free. Scholar Saidiya Hartman reminds us that the historiography of slavery has typically relied, quote, on quantitative matters and on issues of markets and trade relations, end quote, arguing further that the, quote, archive of slavery rests upon a founding violence, end quote, determining what can or cannot be said or who could be seen or not seen of the enslaved by their captors. So Wheatley is an anomaly because she strategically accessed institutions to leverage for her freedom and to leave a vestigial archival trace. But still, we know very little of how and where she lived. And so therefore, the rest of my talk will attempt to piece together some understanding of Wheatley's world through material culture, through things like furniture, other domestic artifacts. And at certain junctures, I will deploy critical fabulation, a practice that Hartman describes as, quote, imagining, quote, what cannot be verified, a realm of experience which is situated between two zones of death, social death and corporeal death, and to reckon with the precarious lives which are visible only at the moment of their disappearance, end quote. And the fact that Wheatley died at 31 means that her social death as a non-person or citizen, she was property, meant that her corporeal death happened sooner than later. So at age 8, a young girl was enslaved and brought to Boston to a family who lived in a house on King and Mackerel Street. Her white owners, John and Susanna Wheatley, named her Phillis, after the brigantine Phillis that had transported her from Senegambia to the port of Boston. And also to her, they bestowed their last name of Wheatley on her. Now, the brigantine Phillis was one of several vessels fitted out to carry human cargo and goods owned by a white merchant, Timothy Fitch, who lived in nearby Medford, Massachusetts. Fitch advised the Phyllis's captain, Peter Gwynn, to purchase 112 slaves and to, quote, get as few girl slaves as possible and as many prime boys as you can. And you can sort of see the equation. The boys are going to grow to men, who can lift and carry. And so the girls were not desirable, but nonetheless, somehow Phyllis was ensnared. Now, these were to be sold, this is what Fitch told Gwynn. The slaves were to be sold first to traders and buyers in Philadelphia, New York City, and New Jersey, where there was no duty or taxes on slaves. The Phyllis, with a crew of 8, undertook the 245-day voyage from commencement to disembarkation, though upon return did not dock at any of these other cities. It left Boston, went to the coast of Senegambia, and actually came back to Boston. Now, of the brigantine Phyllis's cargo of 95 enslaved persons that they picked up in Senegambia, 75 arrived in the port of Boston's Long Wharf on July 11th of 1761, meaning 20 did not survive the Middle Passage. The young girl was sold to the Wheatleys either on board the ship at the Long Wharf or purchased from a white slave dealer, John Avery, at Avery's Wharf, located at the end of Beach Street. And you can see this is from the 13th of July. So 2 days after the ship arrived, just imported from Africa a number of prime young slaves from the Windward Coast, and to be sold aboard Captain Gwynn, lying at New Boston. So Phyllis may not have been sold, the young girl may not have been sold on board precisely because she was a girl. She may have been bought by, they don't know for sure, the slave dealer who was located on Beach Street. So this gives you a sense of that geography. So that's the wharf, that's where the Wheatley's house supposedly is, and that is Beach Street, so Avery. But it's very difficult to exactly pinpoint where these places were. So Phyllis joined the Wheatley's household of young children who were attended over by other enslaved servants, including a black coachman named Prince and a young white male indentured servant. Though not at the center of the slave trade like Virginia or the Tidewater Carolinas, New England states like Massachusetts nonetheless profited from slavery through its commercial interests, like slave trading, slave ship construction, plantation provisioning, and mercantile industries benefiting from goods produced from enslaved labor in places like Jamaica, Barbados, and Virginia. And let me just go back one. So if you look at the advertisement, you can kind of see what was coming in and where they were coming from, what was outward bound and what was just cleared out. And you could see places like Rhode Island, North Carolina, but also you will see Bermuda, St. Kitts, and other places in the Caribbean, and ships bound for Bristol. So you really get a sense of the way in which the triangular trade was working. As well. And oftentimes they were shipping barrels, growing farm goods. Plantation land in places like Barbados were very valuable, so they couldn't use it for crops. So they would grow crops in the US. A lot of this was in South Carolina. Some of it was actually off the coast of on an island, Shelter Island, just north of today's Hamptons, was a provisioning plantation in the 17th century. And they shipped them all the way down to the Caribbean. So it shows you the globality already, right, that was initiated with the monocrop proto-industrial plantation system. So while New Englanders like the Wheatleys depended upon enslaved people as an investment and a source of domestic and commercial labor, although by the mid-18th century, the cause for liberation from the tyranny of the British Crown meant that freedom was understood as a natural right. And some, including free black New Englanders, pressed for the end of slavery in the region. Right? And so this is also a kind of different understanding of slavery than most people have the 19th century, Gone with the Wind, big cotton plantation, in the Mississippi Valley, which was a whole other scale of industrial production, banking, and shipping, and also industrialization. But this was a smaller scale entity. So young Phillis became the Wheatleys' domestic servant, specifically Susanna Wheatley's servant. The Wheatleys were evangelical Christians whose congregationalism was seeded during the Great Awakening movement that emphasized an emotional connection to God and a congregational autonomy. So this is very different from the hierarchical Catholic Church or Church of England. To achieve that connection and strive towards salvation in the afterlife, the ability to read the Word of God, literacy, was essential, even for the enslaved. So Susanna Wheatley oversaw Phillis's religious education, leading to baptism in 1771. Now, the household's daughter, Mary Wheatley, tutored Phillis's classical education. She learned English, then mastered reading in Greek and Latin, a rare educational opportunity for an enslaved person, one that was actually outlawed in many parts of the colonies for fears that if a slave could read and write, they posed a danger to white domination. Now, inspired by the classical verses of Homer and the neoclassical poems of John Milton and Alexander Pope, Phillis began to write poetry, publishing her first poem in the Newport Mercury in 1767. Wheatley's rhetorical skills were evident in her elegies, poems written upon the death of notable religious and political figures, and poems addressed to well-known public figures. Wheatley's poetry engaged the political sphere of letters, one shaped on one hand by the Enlightenment classical forms of political discourse, and on the other by the moral imperatives of Christianity. Now, what we know is that Phillis lived in the Wheatley's house on King and Mackerel, sometimes called Kilby Street, depending on which maps. And Mackerel, I think, is now Kilby Street in today's Boston. From 1761, when she arrived aboard the slave ship Phillis, to 1774, when she gained her freedom. We have no descriptions of the house, its organization of rooms and its interior, or how life unfolded on a daily basis. But there is one example that approximates perhaps Wheatley's domestic milieu, and this can be found in an embroidered work from 1783 by Prudence Punderson, a free white woman living in Connecticut, which is the state just below Massachusetts. Now, Punderson embroidered with silk thread and cloth an arc of her birth, life, and death within the intimate confines of a New England household. Now, within the fabric tableau, Punderson depicts herself sitting at a table, drawing with a pen, paper, ink, inkwell, ruler, and caliper at a tea table, much like the one Wheatley may have used. So it's clear that this might be a workspace, of the woman of the household. She placed herself, this is Punderson, sitting between a wooden crib with a baby and a drop leaf table holding a coffin embellished with PP, which we can assume the coffin is where her corpse was placed, her body was placed. Now, around her, Punderson gathers together cherished possessions, which included a young slave girl servant who sits dutifully watching the sleeping baby Prudence. These domestic possessions, including the girl, served as props to stage an allegory of Punderson's own mortality. And in doing so, she portrays intimacies, to deploy scholar Lisa Lowe's term, to characterize liberal interiority and its connection to domesticity. Now, rather than appear as a prop in the Wheatley's family tableau, which in fact she was to some extent, the Wheatleys had a huge stake on having, this remarkable young enslaved girl public. Scipio Moorhead's depiction of an enslaved servant Phillis sitting at a tea table deep in her own thought, immersed in her own craft, with a radiant aura emanating around her, was a radical portrayal of Black self-fashioning within a white New England household. So to have the enslaved now sit at that table is a kind of radical shift in the social order of the household. Now back to the story of Wheatley's poems. The Wheatley family failed to find in Boston subscribers to publish a book of her writings, of Phillis's writings, a consequence of the rampant doubts of the authenticity of the work and the deteriorating political climate. With greater interest in London for poetry written by an enslaved African, the Wheatleys arranged for Phillis, then 18 years old, to travel there in June of 1773 with Nathaniel Wheatley, the family son. And they both went to promote the London publication of her poems on various subjects, religious and moral. Now, over the course of her 6-week tour, Phillis Wheatley met with many noted public figures. This included the statesman Benjamin Franklin, who had been living in London as a liaison for mid-Atlantic colonies, and he was accompanied by his 2 enslaved servants, Peter and King. She also engaged Selina Hastings, the Countess of Huntington, a prominent religious figure in the Great Awakening, who became a patron for Wheatley's collection of poems. Noted in a letter to David Wooster, dated 18th of October, 1773, Phillis Wheatley describes her whirlwind travels around Greater London. She visited the Tower of London, Westminster Abbey. She saw the crown jewels. She went to the observatory at Greenwich, the hospital. She visited a private tour of the British Museum. She also purchased books. She purchased a copy of Cervantes' Don Quixote and a folio edition of Milton's Paradise Lost. What's interesting is that though Wheatley could have sought her freedom while in London, thanks to the Mansfield Act that ruled that an owner cannot force an enslaved person back to the colonies, which made it a kind of de facto abolition of slavery, since the enslaved could seek emancipation from their owners, Phillis nonetheless returned to Boston with an agreement that she would be freed shortly after her return. And she notes this in the letter to Wooster. She writes, quote, "Since my return to America, my master has, at the desire of my friends in England, given me my freedom," end quote. So nearing liberation, Wheatley had cultivated a transatlantic presence by engaging the Anglo world of arts and letters with the London publication of her poems on various subjects, religious and moral, in 1773. Now, a wealthy statesman, a lawyer, a naturalist, a planter, and slave owner, Thomas Jefferson was also a transatlantic traveler enmeshed in the same European networks of arts and letters, where he encountered Wheatley's books. In 1784, Jefferson, in fact, succeeded Benjamin Franklin as the minister plenipotentiary, basically the ambassador, for the United States to France, a post he held for 5 years. Now, during most of his diplomatic assignment in Paris, he lived in the elegant Hotel de Langeac on the Champs-Élysées with his 2 daughters, Martha and Maria Jefferson. To tend to their needs, Jefferson brought the enslaved siblings, James Hemings as his chef and Sally Hemings as his nursemaid to his children. Both were the half-siblings of Martha Wales Jefferson, his recently deceased wife. Now, to complete his plans for the Virginia Capitol in Richmond, the State House in Richmond, and the writing of the notes on the state of Virginia while living in Paris, Jefferson may have, in fact, regularly utilized one of his traveling desks. Over the course of his life, Jefferson designed and commissioned several lap desks, and you can find these drawings in the different archives of his drawings. Including, these desks were made by craftsmen in Philadelphia, and there were a few that were actually made by the enslaved craftsman John Hemings, who is the half-sibling to Sally and James. And these traveling desks were gifted to family and friends. Now, these desks were typically made of fine mahogany and included storage for paper, quills, and ink. And when he was in Paris, he started designing them to hold a portable copy press that allowed him to make duplicate letters and documents. So record keeping for Jefferson, this is why we have 19,000 letters, like his interest in collecting books and fine wines and arts and ethnographic and geological artifacts, attests to his keen taxonomic and archival sensibility, which are keen to his notes on a state of Virginia, which he published in 1785, also in London. Now, Jefferson's astute deliberation on the moral peril of slavery, tempered by a belief in the natural inferiority of the Negro's mind and body, can be found in Notes on a State of Virginia. Now, the book originated as a report prepared in response to 23 queries sent to Jefferson in 1780 by a French diplomat, Francois Barbé-Mabois. Now, if his designs for the Virginia State House Capitol housed the functions of state governance representing the people of Virginia, Notes of a State of Virginia was a kind of philosophical and natural history addressed in part to a European audience and attesting to the geographical and political fitness of the region and its inhabitants, or at least those of European descent. And I have a longer, this part on Wheatley is part of a longer essay that I wrote that was published in Race and Modern Architecture that looks at Jefferson's design of the State House in relation to what he writes in Notes on the State of Virginia. So in Notes, Jefferson took stock of the state's natural features, like the cave that he draws a section through, and its inhuman inhabitants. And this is a kind of taxonomy of the Native Americans in the Piedmont region where he actually had his plantations. And so he looks at human inhabitants, its natural features, and in the first part, his taxonomic assessment of plants and animals, minerals, these are, highlighting the state's bountiful resources. He noted that natural laws also governed the human species residing within the state's boundaries and divided them into three racial taxonomies: Europeans, Aboriginals, and Africans. And so these assessments appear through all of the sections of the book. The book also reviewed the state's systems and institutions, and this is kind of a query. The organization of the book reviews the state's systems and institutions that organized its society, namely commerce and manufacturing, governance, religion, and civil society. And so you could see it sort of starts in the natural realm and slowly moves into the human-made realm, and then the end is sort of history, right? That's the arc that he constructs here. So intimately familiar with Virginia's Constitution, because he wrote this, Jefferson outlined the government's branches and duties, noting in detail the rights and laws that adjudicated the legal status and relationships, albeit unequally, between the aforementioned races of the Europeans, the Aboriginals, and the Africans. Now, in Query 14, Jefferson concerns himself with the administration of justice, not only centered on jurisprudence, laws made by free white men and administered by the state, but how those laws related to the laws of nature and the divine will of God. Along with political concerns, Jefferson therefore held, quote, physical and moral objections, end quote, to Negroes based on how a planter's lifetime of observations of their comportment, that is, of their body, and of their character, that is, their mind. And because universal reason relied upon experimentation and observation for the validation of truth, Jefferson's conceptualization of the racial paradigm of human difference found one promise register in skin color. He determined skin color then as, quote, fixed in nature, end quote, and therefore of divine causation. The aesthetics of blackness was part of a rationalization of the variations in the human species that divided peoples living on the continents of Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and affirmed the superiority of Europeans and their whiteness. even the Europeans who were on the continents of the New World. So of the Negro's supposed inability to appreciate beauty, except in the most sensual manner, or to create works of true aesthetic value, except out of mimicry, also provided Jefferson with additional evidence of their mental inferiority. So in Query 14, Jefferson surmised that in their ability to remember, blacks were equal to whites. But in their ability to reason and comprehend things like mathematics and the sciences, or even write poetry, they were certainly inferior. Quote, in their imagination, they were dull, tasteless, and anomalous, end quote. To affirm the truth of his observation, Jefferson offered examples of composer, writer Ignatius Sancho, then living in London, and the poet Phillis Wheatley, whose both books, were in Jefferson's library. Now, in Jefferson's mind, Phillis Wheatley possessed the inferior traits of both her race and gender. Now, despite Wheatley's remarkable achievements under the harshest of circumstances, Jefferson writes in Notes of the State of Virginia that he believed her incapable of writing poetry, since love for the Negro could only stimulate the senses, but not the imagination. And yet, in her poem On Imagination, Wheatley proclaims, quote, soaring through the air to find a bright abode, thy imperial palace of thundering God, as a gesture of creative and conceptual play of a liberated subject that presages Immanuel Kant's arguments in his Critique of Judgment of 1790. Now, Jefferson wrote that Wheatley's poems were, quote, below the dignity of criticism, end quote. And yet, Wheatley's skillful deployment of classicism entered seamlessly into the discourse of a newly forming revolutionary sphere of Jefferson and the Founding Fathers. Now, for Jefferson, Christianity, gleaned directly from reading the Bible rather than the corrupted church doctrine, provided an ethical framework for how this new society would live together. Both Wheatley and Jefferson would agree that slavery was morally compromising and a corrupting force that must be ended. But they diverged on the immediacy of ending slavery. Wheatley believed that freedom from enslavement for Africans must be a part of the revolutionary agenda, and this is what she writes in letters and her poetry. Whereas Jefferson, in Notes on a State of Virginia, offered a gradual plan of emancipation followed by self-deportation. Wheatley sought liberation at that moment to guarantee that she and other enslaved Africans could live freely in the United States. Jefferson deferred emancipation to the future in order to live off his investments in a slave-owning society and economy. Jefferson, in his response to Query 14, asserted that blackness was a sublime, quote, eternal monotony, an immovable veil of black which covers all emotions of the other race, end quote. So blackness was impenetrable to him. And so while all men were born equal, as natural rights proponent had advocated, and Jefferson literally wrote in the Declaration of Independence, Negroes possess neither the aptitude to reason nor the faculties to appreciate beauty or value liberty. The people of Virginia, and by extension of the United States, did not include its peoples of African descent. The prospect of a free Black American made up of people like Phillis Wheatley was both unreasonable and unimaginable to the sage of Monticello. Now, one of the few 18th century American women to have ever been published, Wheatley used her public stature to advocate for American independence and for the natural rights of slaves. She adeptly used her rhetorical skills to subtly call out the moral hypocrisy of leading figures' quest for political and spiritual freedom, while they were still deeply invested in holding and trading enslaved people for whom liberation and salvation could be achieved in the afterlife, but never in the enlightened world of the British colonies or the newly independent United States. And there's a really great painting of John Trumbull of the writing of the Declaration of Independence, and there's another, I would say, meme of that showed dots for the majority of the so-called founding fathers who owned enslaved people. Now, upon her return from London to Boston in July of 1773, Phillis Wheatley was freed by her owner, John Wheatley, who honored their agreement made prior to her journey to London. She fled to Providence, Rhode Island, when the British invaded Boston in the spring of 1775. Wheatley returned there in 1776, and it is believed that she remained in Boston for pretty much the rest of her life. She married a free black man, a shopkeeper, and a laborer, John Peters, in 1778, and they moved around the city. As achieving any type of financial security as a freed black person proved insurmountable. She had children, though the number and their fate is unknown. She continued to have intermittent bouts of ill health. Her collection of poetry continued to be read widely. George Washington had a copy, for example, and she published new poems in response to current events in newspapers and pamphlets, including one poem that she dedicated during the Revolution to Washington, General Washington. But despite her literary success, Wheatley failed to find a publisher for a second book of poetry and letters. She advertised this in various newspapers, but could not find the subscribers to support this endeavor. And Wheatley died indigent in Boston at age 31 on December 5th in 1784. But beyond her writings, which is what she's known for and what scholars pore over, did Wheatley leave other traces, or have the archives remained silent? Now, once a black person is freed and no longer property, the archival trail in legal documents, such as wills and bill of sales and manumission documents, often disappears, given the prohibition on the ability of freed blacks to acquire property and seek legal redress. People just disappear, and that could be one reason why very little is known about Wheatley once she's freed. It is also important because citizenship was denied to free blacks. They were not the people. Now, the only extant artifact believed to be owned by Phillis Wheatley is a convertible mahogany tea table. I just wanted to show this. This is Queen Street, where John Peters is believed to have had a shop. So this gives you a sense of the geography of Boston that she would have lived in, besides her trip to London and her life prior to being the enslaved person, Phillis Wheatley. Now, this is the only artifact that we have, which is a convertible mahogany card and tea table, dated to 1786, again, Queen Anne style. Now, the table's flexibility may have been an ideal for the kind of spaces Wheatley would have lived as a free black person in Boston, and its size made it easily portable. The multi-purpose table may have been the one that Moorhead featured in his portrait, capturing her as she wanted to have been remembered. Some believe it may have been given to her by the Wheatley family, but nothing was left to her from the estate of John Wheatley. Domestic commodities and craft objects like furniture, fabric, embroidery can be evidence of those whose lives do not readily appear in archives of record. The mahogany desk is a trace that appeared, as Hartman proposes, at the moment of Wheatley's disappearance. Now, one concluding observation that brings the world of Wheatley and Jefferson together is that both desks are crafted from mahogany, a luxurious and durable wood resistant to termites and whose dense grain resisted warping and rots. And as I said earlier, it was a material that could be polished to this incredibly rich hue. Now, albeit a humble object from the domestic sphere, the table's mahogany traveled the same transatlantic trade routes as the young captured girl who would be renamed Phillis Wheatley. The enclosure of native Indian lands in the Caribbean and also in Central and South America by European colonists to establish monocrop plantations necessitated the deforestation undertaken often by enslaved Africans. By the early 18th century, large quantities of mahogany were being shipped as ballast from places like Barbados and Jamaica to furniture makers in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and London. So it sort of overtakes local materials like maple and walnut as the material of choice, certainly for the elites and for the merchant class. Scholar Elaine Feelgood demystifies the allegorical presence of mahogany in later Victorian novels like Jane Eyre as, quote, the furniture that remembers, as it were, the ubiquity of slavery and the geography and history of the Atlantic slave trade, end quote. Mahogany also unsettles liberal interiority by situating it, as Lisa Lowe argues, quote, in relation to the global processes and colonial connections that are the conditions of its production, end quote. So before both Wheatley and Jefferson, the ownership of mahogany furniture facilitated different degrees of utility for their writing. They were both people of the world of arts and letters, but also for their self-fashioning. The furniture also, appears within gendered and class spaces of culture and taste. And yet, for Wheatley, despite her tenacity, her intellectual acuity, her creative insights into a world in which the precious freedom of the revolutionary moment was erected on the backs of the unfree, the unceasing violence of whiteness that began in the abyss of the hold of the brigantine Phillis rapidly extinguished poet Phillis's flight to her bright abode, shortly after she had negotiated her own liberation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mabel. That was fantastic. Really nice talk. We will open to the audience in a minute with questions.
You can actually leave that up, just in case somebody has a question.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Leave it up. We can press play again. Especially those two objects. Nice to have up there. Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, so we will open up to the audience, so get your questions ready in your heads, but we thought we'll give you a moment and ask maybe some of our own questions, of which we have plenty in comments. I was really struck by how you meandered between the painful histories of Phillis Wheatley and Thomas Jefferson's legacies, and then brought it down to these two objects, which I think I hadn't heard before in your work and hadn't seen before. So I think there's something about the craft of writing that is in there. And I had another question about audience, but actually I want to ask about those two writing desks. This one looks so used and so don't know whether it looks masculine, but somehow, maybe just by projecting from myself, it looks masculine because it has these stains on it. And this one looks so pristine. I don't know whether it's just the photography, but it looks so pristine and polished. And I wonder whether you know anything how they survived and how they are ascribed to both of them. I mean, I'm sure that Thomas Jefferson, there's no question of how it has been ascribed. He wanted it to be ascribed to him. But how was this ascribed to Phillis Wheatley?
I don't know the exact provenance of it, but it is believed to have been known by her. It could have been restored at some point, which is why it's in, this sort of condition. But I also think this was a kind of piece of furniture that would have been on view, right, in the sitting room. So it would have been more public. Jefferson was always able to retreat to his study, right, which is a very male space. Like like when you see him, let me see. I didn't explain these because I know I didn't have a lot of time. But, where is it? Oh, here he is. Yeah. So when we see here in Monticello, right, that's adjacent to his bed, that's his study. he has this desk, there's another writing contraption, his books, all of these things that he had crafted to facilitate, literally, his letter writing. What he would call, I think he called it his drudgery, is to write all these letters. But like this is a kind of retreat, a kind of almost, it's an observatory. Mark Wheatley has a really great essay from years ago called Untitled, where he talks about the gendered space of the study, and that is what that is. And that's what I thought was interesting, that if it were a tea table, and I don't think anybody's ever considered what she was sitting at, I haven't been able to find it, is that when you think about it as a tea table, of course, it's going to be in the sitting room. It's going to be, kind of in a space of gendered sociality, right? And it's pretty radical to then have this enslaved person sitting at the table, right? Because she should be on the side taking care of the baby, right? And, in the way in which Punderson depicts that household.
Actually, her table being defined as a card table. That piece, that also, playing cards is also such a class practice. It's things where men or women would do that would be served by someone else while playing cards. So I think that's quite significant. The other question I had was about audience, how much we know about how much her book was read and by whom, and whether it was really sold more in London than when it took off. Or if
it was very widely read. It was very well known. It was widely read by a lot of people. I mean, she really did. But the thing that I don't talk about, because it's part of the larger section in this chapter, that she had to have 15 people verify that she actually wrote the poetry. So at the beginning, all of these, they testify, these Bostonians testify that she in fact did write these poems, right? So all of that had to be put into place. But her biographer, Vincent Coretta, said she's very shrewd. Like she was able to really navigate, to also make sure that she was going to get paid and that, that everything was in place so that when she was going to be freed, right, that she would have, some kind of income, which is believed that she did, but it was still nonetheless very difficult because she wasn't able to do a second volume.
Right. Very fascinating. Sigrid?
Yeah, maybe I can continue in this. Thank you, Mabel. That was really, really inspiring. I really liked also the way you filled the gaps, let's say, with talking about objects and trying to understand what really happened here. I was thinking about this when you addressed this idea of critical fabulation that Hartman writes about. If you could tell us a bit more about how you see the role actually of fiction, both used as a source, let's say, by us historians, and as a method. So what do we do when we have gaps and we still want to tell the story? So just to...
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great question because, sometimes it's just presumed, like when you write a history, you'll go to the archive. But what if there's nothing in the archive? Like, what do you do? And I've had that happen repeatedly in my work, like with Negro building. One thing that my editor said was he was really amazed that nobody had written these histories of fairs. One, they're not permanent, they're temporary, so you have to think of architecture differently. And if you're going to find the sources, especially of the Negro buildings and the Black emancipation fairs and all the other ones, you're not also going to find extensive archives like that were kept by governments or states, because Blacks didn't have access to public institutions in that way. So they're just spread all over the place and different, so you have to somehow, again, like look differently. But also, in this project, working in the archive of slavery, which is what Hartman has written about in Venus in Two Acts, that's where she writes first about critical fabulations and then really takes it on in her book Wayward Lives. How do you write about people who are not, who aren't the Jeffersons, right? But who may appear, in criminal records, who may appear in, as statistics. Like, how do you recuperate some sense of their lives without further enacting a kind of violence, right? And so, kind of working on on, this project, Building Race and Nation, I've had to really think about that. And Jefferson is insane. If you've ever gone in, like his work is annotated across like all these 19,000 letters. You can find out what Thomas Jefferson ate. I mean, it's like everything. And he was obsessive. He kept these diaries of like, in his industry of manufacturing of nails, he had slaves making nails, and selling them. Today they made so-and-so nails. We have to change. Like he was obsessive record keeper in a way. So there's a kind of overabundance about him, but we don't know anything about very little about the Hemings. We don't know what happened to Sally Hemings, for example, once she is freed, after she spent many years as his concubine. And so, there's a kind of unevenness. So critical fabulations is a kind of way of trying to fill in the gaps of those records. And in the book that I'm working on, this is the problem. We can know what Jefferson thought about Washington, D.C., but the labor who built Washington, D.C. and lived and maintained, we don't know anything. So how do you start to imagine what that might be? But they appear in things like paintings, or they'll appear in manumission court proceedings, or in court cases. So there are ways of finding where people were. And so then you have to kind of backtrack and begin to imagine who they were.
And I think that's a topic that will return during the conference now, because we all have to deal with this in a way. I think we should let the audience ask some questions.
Thank you. A brief observation on this frontispiece portrait, the text written below, that whatever may be the portrait itself is sold at a bookseller near the Saracen's Head, Aldgate. I wondered what this address might, and its name might imply, the Saracen's Head, Aldgate.
That I do not know. I have not researched, I'm not a Wheatley scholar, so I have not researched here the publisher, the publisher was Archibald Bell, I think. So that I do not know.
It's just a name, Saracens.
I know,
These are black persons, no, aren't they? Well,
but it isn't, how these histories of empire get embedded in place names.
I know, even in Zurich.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Just the work that I did in, the piece we did in Venice, as well, is a kind of meditation. I work with my collaborators, Mijin Yoon and Eric Howler. Mijin's the dean at Cornell. Eric teaches at the GSD. They have a practice, Howler and Yoon. We did a kind of meditation on the archive that we had, that we put together, but was also given to us by the University of Virginia when we worked on the memorial to enslaved laborers at UVA in Charlottesville. I have this Jefferson obsession because I went to UVA. That's why. And I'm just working that out in this particular project. But even with that memorial, the way I describe it is we were told the university is going to fund this memorial. And the community said, we want names, we want to see who they were, we want dates. But when you go to the archive, there is nothing there. And so I think in the end, what we came up with were kind of provisional ways of marking. So since they think 4,000 people worked and built the university, we have gashes or memory marks for all 4,000. Sometimes there's a name, often a first name. For the records that we had as references, which were about 400, we have familial kinship relations, so mother, daughter, sister, and then we have occupations. So you might see John and Isabella Gibbons, laundress, and then daughter or grandmother somewhere. So we tried to kind of take the ledger form and turn it into a genealogical cloud to unleash the violence that was in the archive. Because the only way they appear on the ledger is like 3 Negro hands hired at Christmas for $2 or something like that. So, there's a very interesting way in which, and certainly in these projects, I've been thinking about how does one work, with absences or silences, to use the term in archives.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question about imagination. You explained that it meant something that was aligned with art, science, and mathematics. And I wonder if you can expand a little bit in this kind of division that they were doing and what she says about imagination herself. And I was wondering a similar question, like who did publish this book finally? But also if you have found some kind of scientific explanations on why she does have imagination, or why at least she can write, or some kind of, what was the reaction to kind of explain the situation, or there was any, or if you found something about this.
She just was educated. I mean, she's a smart person, she's bright, she's perceptive, they gave her books, she learned. She wasn't the only person. Ignacio Sancho, Equiano was another, there were a number of people who engaged in this world of arts and letters. She was unusual because she was very young and she was a woman, and that made her really unusual. She was a young girl to be able to be engaged in that in that realm. So, but the other part you had a second part of the question.
Yeah. My question was more like in this definition, if imagination was this line between the slavery and the free.
I actually started looking up philosophies on imagination, and I think there's somebody named, I could be wrong, Baird, who divided, it's like there's history, there's imagination, that there is a kind of structure of, and where imagination lands in knowledge that influenced somebody like Thomas Jefferson. So when he says imagination, he's thinking, with his, his naturalist, his natural philosophers hat on. So he has a very specific definition of it. And I think it might be in one of the footnotes of where, why he says she could not possess this. But clearly she writes on imagination, and she too is well read. So she also understood what it meant to have that facility in a way. But it's really interesting. That she was able, and there might have, been others, but we don't have the trace. The thing is that she got published, and that the Wheatleys were willing to say, this is unusual, this is important, it shows the promise of abolition and emancipation.
Yes, I do agree. It's beautiful that she's using this card of emancipation on this title.
Yeah, and she had to walk a tightrope, right? Because this is also a moment in which there are royalists, there are revolutionaries, like what side are you going to fall on, And because she was a public figure, she had to be very careful with how she couched it. But she was saying some pretty radical stuff in some of her other writings, actually.
I just chip in there, were there critics that picked up on it and countered Jefferson in some way? Or is it really not, is the criticism more on Jefferson's side, sort of the...
Oh no, he was criticized for it, particularly with the rising abolitionism amongst the Quakers, of which Franklin was one. In the chapter following this, I have a whole section on Benjamin Banneker, who was a mathematician, again, self-taught. He was free, but he surveys part of Washington, D.C. with Ellicott. And part of the reason he's on that is to challenge what Jefferson writes in Notes on the State of Virginia. He joins the party because the Quaker abolitionists were like, oh, no, see this guy? And then it's interesting because Banneker writes this letter to Jefferson. And Jefferson is like, oh, wait, this guy's really smart. Maybe I was wrong. He's like, and he writes a letter to Condorcet, I think, saying, you should really check out this, this guy, Benjamin Banneker, Yeah. So, there were debates about what was the so-called intellectual capacity of enslaved and freed Africans.
Jane?
Thanks for absolutely stunning, brilliant talk. We really, really enjoyed it and learned a lot. Just have one kind of comment that's coming out of the questions as well, and I'm sure we'll discuss it more together as the days go by. But this question of how to kind of presence absence, or how to make how to bring invisibility into a kind of traceable form, and it strikes me that actually, in terms of historiography, we don't really have the tools. We have some amazing writers, Saidiya Hartman and others who have been working with this for some time, your own work. But I think it's a growing area, and I actually think that theoretically we're going to develop this much more because of the kind of work that people like historians like you are doing in terms of what happens when the archives are really not there at all. I mean, we found this before in feminist history, but I think when it becomes kind of the history of slaves, it brings it to the fore much more strongly. So I think there's something really interesting about the way in which we kind of handle complete absences. It's something that's come up in the paper that I'm going to talk about, which I'm not going to say now, but on later in the week. But so that was one observation. But the other thing that I'd love to know a bit more about, because I feel like I really don't understand it fully, is that the term servant we would now use usually to talk about someone who is in some senses in paid employment. They would have received some kind of wage, whereas this obviously isn't the case. In the example that you're talking about, but neither is a servant a slave. So can you just say something about the terminologies that are used at this in this period of time and stuff?
Sure. I mean, essentially what Wheatley was a lady's maid. Yeah, and they were often referred to as servants, even if you were enslaved. And it's complicated. You know, I didn't talk about this, but you know, they're indentured people. That are also a part, you know, of this whole sphere, and you know, it's a question of like, how long is your bond, basically? Is it for 5 years? Is it for 10 years? Or is it in perpetuity, right? So slavery is bonded in perpetuity, right, until you die, essentially, or unless you can get your freedom. But there are also freed blacks, you know, and you also have enslaved indigenous. In Boston, there were enslaved people coming from the Carolinas and Georgia as well, enslaved Native Americans, actually. So it's complicated how one... So in the larger project, I actually do look at the history of indentureship. Property became a big part of the project, both in an understanding of self-possession, but also what does it mean to possess something like land? And the project also takes on indigenous dispossession as well. And so, yeah, these questions of like labor, you know, kind of, they move throughout the book in different ways.
But there is, yeah, that's fascinating. And there's something very interesting about the way you've been returning to this idea of a kind of, not necessarily an autonomy, but maybe an ethopoesis, or this self-fashioning that you're talking about, which I think is such an important way of thinking about the resistance that's possible for a person who's unpaid and is whose autonomy has been removed in many ways. That this project of kind of making oneself into a writer that has an audience. I mean, it's a really, really interesting and inspiring history. Apart from the end, of course.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the poems and the images of Black futurity, as you called it, in them. With the brief quote that you showed at the beginning, I was kind of, I was intrigued. I was wondering, what do you make of the fact that an enslaved author writing for people who worked in the fields employs pastoral imagery? Or, for instance, a person writing for people who are forced to build neoclassical buildings employs classical imagery. How do you think she...
You know, she was writing for a literate audience. Like, she knew exactly who she was. That's why I said she had to be very careful in terms of how she couched what she was trying to convey, especially, you know, kind of pressing, saying, okay, so you're fighting for liberty from the British Crown, but what about these people that you own? Why can't they too be free if all men are created equal? And so she was actually speaking to this enlightened European world of arts and letters, of which had, you know, and as I said, a number of people who had been enslaved. There were Native Americans who were part of that that world. She writes quite often to a Christian. He was a reverend who was, I believe, Native American, and so she has a correspondence with him. In fact, and so the ways in which people moved into these roles, given the kind of social structure of British North America, is fascinating and complicated, right? But she just, she mobilized it and she got her freedom. Like, I think she knew, and she may not have actually wanted to go to London because she was intermittently sick her entire life, actually. So she knew the voyage was going to be a very difficult one. She had fun, though. It sounded like she had a blast. But she was also very loyal to Susanna Wheatley, who was quite sick. So she, in fact, I think her biographers believe she came back because Susanna Wheatley had become ill and she wanted to be there when she passed away.
How old was she when she arrived to Boston? Can you remind us?
She was 8.
She was 8.
And died at 31.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jefferson lived to 83. Yeah. Long life.
Yeah. I wanted actually to follow up a bit on the previous question and to ask to what extent that she uses conventions of genre to mediate her position. So she writes in a classical tradition, so she's very literate, so which means she imitates, so she relates herself to literary models, to literary tropes.
Yeah.
And
I am not a literary scholar. So if you read those who do this, they go through line by, and she's quoting this person, and she had read that. They knew what book she had. Yeah. Like, I don't go into that world.
No. But it also relates a little bit to this whole question of imagination, and also the way Jefferson then racializes imagination, which is astonishing. I mean, so is there somewhere, for instance, in Jefferson's criticism, a kind of claim that what she does is actually reproduction rather than creative production? Or
in his mind it's just mimicry, but in her mind she's in dialogue. Like, this is what poets do, is they, it's the phrasing, it's the couplets, it's the, that they are modeled on, others. It's knowledge is not singular, it's not a creative genius. It's the knowledge that is shared amongst people. And the fact that she read quite a lot and was inspired and, But it's interesting because, there's a whole book on Wheatley that shows how she was way ahead of people like Emerson, like her impact on Samuel Coleridge Taylor. Like, she was doing things that then by the 19th century actually become part of Romanticism. Which is very interesting. So she was actually, quite unusual as a poet. But I don't, it's not my world. I don't read a lot of poetry.
Thanks so much. And maybe slightly following on from what you were just talking about, being a kind of proto-romanticist. But I was just wondering, when she made this tour of London and Great Britain, was it just London? Or?
Yeah, I think it was mostly London. I don't know. I don't recall if she leaves. Well, she's only there for 6 weeks. Okay. So, yeah. But she had fun. She literally said, I'm up at this hour, and then we're going to do this, and we're going to go there, we're going to be out late. She partied.
So that's brilliant. So that's what I was going to ask a little bit about. Like, apart from meeting people and going to a party or being shown around the British Museum, do you have any information about whether she gave any readings aloud of her work? Because kind of within that time, these kind of ideas of active speech and kind of a kind of 18th, 19th performative speech is happening, and revolutionary speech is happening in a different kind of way, often when it's being spoken aloud compared to when it's on the...
I don't think she did, actually. Not that I recall or that I remember. Kind of reading about where she went. No, she didn't. But she met with a lot of people, including Granville Sharp, who is a very well-known abolitionist. So, she met. And in fact, I think she doesn't I don't think Nathaniel Wheatley knew that she had met Sharp, because he was a huge advocate for the abolition, and of both the trade but also the freeing of the enslaved and plantations. So, and he's one of the founders of Sierra Leone, which is a whole other complicated narrative. But yeah, she had fun.
Yeah, thank you. I actually have two questions. So I was wondering, I'm sure you have read the poems and her letters, and reading them as an architecture historian, not a literary scholar. What is your take on, or are there any traces of her reading space, writing about space, or how she experiences space, and if there's a difference, so when she's in Boston, when she's in London, when she's sort of still an enslaved person, once she's freed? So that would be the first question about sort of spatial description or spatial impressions of hers. And then the other question is regarding friendship. Are there any sort of female networks that get established over time that she is sort of like in writing, in conversation with other female writers of her time, or is she sort of like a patron or someone who supports other younger women coming up in that? I know she died at 31, you said, but like, is there any like kind of like friendship networks that you came across and that were
I don't know. Again, I'm not a Wheatley scholar. Like, people have poured over every aspect of her life, and there's so much you don't know because she was she was enslaved and she was a servant. So it's hard to know what her social milieu was when she was enslaved and when she wasn't. There are hints, apparently, if you go through her letters, you start to sense of who she, was speaking to, but I don't think they know, were there additional letters, what's missing, what don't we, what's available. And in terms of her, the body of her work, which I don't know well, I've read some, but I'm not a poet and a scholar. And she is actually she's a kind of a minor figure as part of the chapter. I kind of expanded this in response to the listening in call. But she does have a sense of geography. She does, have a sense of the transatlantic in a way. She does talk about Africa and where she came from. She is aware of other people. Like, she doesn't meet Ignacio Sancho when she's in London, but he knew she was there, and he writes about the hypocrisy of those who are proclaiming a kind of revolutionary freedom, and yet she is still enslaved. There were people who are aware of who she was, but we just, unlike we don't know the details. That's the thing that's kind of missing. But she does seemingly, kind of have a sense of her own kind of geography in a way. But it doesn't really describe, like, she is kind of speaking to a kind of a world of ideas in a way, and it's not a kind of quotidian poetry, right, of the everyday. So, yeah, if it were, we would know more, right? And she's not a novelist, right? I mean, this isn't, she's not a Bronte, so she's not kind of writing in that might have captured it. She's sort of writing in this classical poetry, and then she's writing these very public letters to be published in newspapers and pamphlets, and so it's speaking to that realm of ideas and not to the kind of, physical, material, everyday existence. Yeah, if she had left a diary, it would have been amazing.
Maybe it's more the mental space and the printed space that she claimed, I think, which is something that we had as well. One sec, the mic is coming.
Thank you very much for amazing talk. I'm also, again, going back to the question on imagination. like I see that especially with the quote that you started and having the book of Cruising Utopia of Monno's and the whole like the terminology around imagination, that blackness and queerness, they are futureless, and the way that like we can work against or through them is always starting with collective imagination or imagining otherwise. So like building, exactly. So I'm just like first, so my like question asked in a very easy way is that the way that like she was writing on imagination, how was that different from a white man writing on imagination? Was she, for example, writing not very implicitly, but maybe explicitly thinking from or thinking for a collective imagination? And so I'm just like thinking if there is a bit like she's bringing in some collective imaginations. And I'm asking this because like for me, from my ears, she's a very extraordinary figure. And I'm just like thinking that if reading her writing on imagination, we can also think of maybe the same like enslaved women, but the ones that who did not have the privilege of reading or writing, but like we can also be like trace that implicit collective imagination behind her. And then I'm just like thinking that if also like her writing on imagination can also be related to thinking or collectively imagining some kind of otherwise future, or even like is it like political writing or is it like a philosophical writing on imagination?
I think she does both, actually. There are some poems where she really does call for an end to slavery, which again was kind of, a sort of bold gesture to make. But she understood that she had the visibility and the ability to get her work into a pamphlet or a newspaper or something. So she doesn't do this with every poem, or every letter that she writes, but she does, she does make that demand for her people, right? In a way, and I do think, with like Orlando Patterson's idea of social death, right? And for me, the clearest articulation of it is Michel Foucault's "Make, Live, Let Die." That modern governmentality allows you to either move resources so that you thrive, right? You make those lives viable, or you let them die by not having the resources, right? And probably in her case, because her husband, did not have regular pay, a source of income, he was in debtor's prison a lot, it's the let die, the inability to have rights, to have legal recourse, to be paid fairly, means that the ability to survive in a society means that, as Orlando Pett, you're socially dead. You're going to have a shorter life expectancy, basically. So what the future is, given that your death is imminent, is a premature death, is the question around like Black futurity, marronage, all of those kinds of questions. Because, the configuration, of capitalism and nationalism and like all of these isms, liberal, doesn't give you a space to live, basically. And so, I think that the fact she dies at 31 is exactly, even though she's free, her freedom didn't remove the misery at all. It's just like, in the United States, when African Americans move from the South to the North, and Richard Wright writes about this beautifully. It's like, we're going to, no, it's just a different kind of misery, right? You're still discriminated against. You still get crappy housing. It's colder. It's not it's just another form, right? So freedom doesn't necessarily get you away from the violence, right? That will end your life, the systemic violence that will end your life. And I think Wheatley does to some extent speak to that. But the imagination gives her an opportunity to find perhaps a bright abode, or at least imagine someplace, as you said, elsewhere or otherwise.
That's what struck me in the portrait that we see nicely dimmed now. It's actually nice because it looks to me as if she looks elsewhere.
Yeah, she
somehow.
does.
And that's maybe an act of dissent or of transgressing, because she claims that other space for herself, which is in her poems, freedom in her poems, but maybe not in other ways. Do we have a final question, or shall we relieve Mabel and give her a well-earned drink? Is there anything burning? Otherwise, I suggest we do that over a drink. Yes?
Great.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much, Mabel.